Hello, in this chapter we're going to talk about international governance initiatives. During the late 90s and the early 2000s, the idea of the resource curse started gaining traction in policy circles. This was the same time that commodity prices were rising and an increasing number of developing countries were debuting as producers of oil and mineral resources. Prompted by these developments, there emerged a number of international initiatives that sought to mitigate the negative impacts of natural resource wealth. Today I'm going to provide a quick mapping of these efforts and then focus a bit on the programs that advance transparency. A number of the initiatives are multilateral or run by multilateral institutions. The most prominent is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or the EITI, and I'll talk more about that one a little bit later. But there were a few others as well. The African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa came together to create the Africa Mining Vision, which sets out guidance for how African countries can benefit most from their natural resources. Then, individual African countries are invited to produce their own country mining visions. The World Bank has launched an online extractive industries sourcebook and has devoted a lot of attention to natural resource issues in its technical assistance work. The International Monetary Fund has published a guide to resource revenue transparency, and the International Financial Corporation, the IFC, talks about extractives explicitly in its performance standards on environmental and social sustainability, which apply to all the projects that the IFC finances. Other multilateral initiatives are not specific to the extractive sector, but they still have an impact. The Open Government Partnership has a working group on natural resources, and a number of participating countries have chosen to include extractives-related issues in their commitments. For example, Colombia included a commitment to greater openness in how they manage their mining royalties in their OGP action plan. Also relevant is the OECD G20 Inclusive Framework on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, or BEPS, which aims to give governments tools to combat tax avoidance, specifically to combat the strategies used by companies to shift income to low or no tax jurisdictions. The OECD also holds regular policy dialogues on natural resource-based development, which convenes experts and stakeholders to address issues such as corruption risks, contract negotiation, revenue management, and local content and infrastructure. The G7 has publicly supported extractive sector transparency for over a decade, and the issue often features within their anti-corruption programs, including their efforts to tackle the issue of secret corporations. The G7 also runs a program called CONEX, which aims to build the capacity of developing countries in extractive sector contract negotiations. The G20 has expressed its support for the EITI, and it has a working group on corruption, which has in the past dealt with some extractive-related issues. Moving over to the civil society side, several NGOs came together in 2002 to create Publish What You Pay. Since then, Publish What You Pay has grown into a global coalition of over 800 members. Alongside many national NGOs, a few international NGOs were created to deal just with resource governance issues, such as Global Witness and Revenue Watch. A number of long-standing NGOs, like Oxfam and Transparency International, have chosen to devote a lot of their resources to extractive sector issues. In 2010, the Natural Resource Charter was launched. Developed by a group of international independent experts, the Charter offers guidance on the key decisions that governments face when managing natural resources. In 2013, the Natural Resource Charter and Revenue Watch merged to form the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is one of the conveners of this course. More on the academic side, the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment, another convener of this course, does a lot of applied research and convening on extractive-related issues as well. There's a whole other set of initiatives that target the private sector. Some of them, like the International Council on Mining and Metals, or ICMM, or the World Gold Council, have mining companies as their members. Both of these bodies set standards that all of their members choose to abide by. Several other initiatives push companies to raise their standards of supply chain due diligence. Most of these aim to decrease the trade in conflict minerals. The OECD produces extensive guidance on this topic. In 2017, the EU passed regulations that will require European companies, beginning in 2021, to follow those OECD guidance when importing tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold from countries affected by conflict or at high risk of human rights abuses. Specific to diamonds, the Kimberley process is a supply chain certification scheme that includes roughly 54 participants who mine over 99% of the world's rough diamonds. A number of other voluntary initiatives are relevant because lots of oil and mining companies choose to participate in them. These include corporate social responsibility standards and reporting standards, such as the UN Global Compact, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the Global Reporting Initiative, which addresses sustainability issues. On the investor side, 90 financial institutions in 37 countries have adopted the Equator Principles, which spell out good practices that investors should follow to reduce social and environmental risk. There's also something called the Santiago Principles, which is for sovereign wealth funds, and over 30 sovereign wealth funds have signed up to abide by these principles. Many of these funds contain mostly oil revenues. The Santiago Principles mostly address things like transparency, accountability, and oversight mechanisms that sovereign wealth funds should adopt. So that's a brief overview of what's out there, although of course there are a number of other projects and initiatives that I didn't name, and an ever-growing number of country-based and regional initiatives. I want to spend a little bit more time now talking about transparency, because a number of different approaches have arisen, and they have some important differences. First, let's tackle the EITI. The EITI is voluntary and it's multi-stakeholder. So when a government chooses to join the EITI, they basically agree to do two things. First, they agree to disclose a certain set of information. And second, they agree to set up a multi-stakeholder body to oversee the reporting process that has representatives from government, civil society, and the private sector. So far, 52 countries from all around the world have signed up to implement the EITI. So if you're a company that operates in one of those 52 countries, you have to disclose certain information through a countrywide reporting process. For example, if you're a Canadian company that's working in Nigeria, you'll have to submit information to the Nigerian EITI, even though Canada itself is not a member. In its early years, EITI reports only included a reconciliation of payment data. Companies disclosed how much they paid to governments, governments disclosed how much they received from the companies, and an independent administrator was hired to compare the two sets of figures. But this kind of transparency is too narrow, so in 2013, the EITI expanded its reporting requirements. The payment reconciliation is still required, but companies also provide other important information, such as a registry of which companies hold licenses, financial data from the state-owned companies, what share of extractive revenues go to subnational governments, as well as others. As a result, EITI reports have grown much more useful and informative over the years. In 2016, the EITI standard was expanded again to require reporting on beneficial owners of the companies that hold exploration and production licenses, a key step to making corruption more difficult. The EITI also recently adopted a civil society protocol in response to the repression and intimidation faced by civil society in several of its implementing countries. Because the EITI is a voluntary measure, lots of oil and mineral-rich countries choose not to participate, including some places with very severe corruption and resource governance problems. This is why mandatory reporting requirements by home countries are so important, because they can help fill that gap. As of 2016, companies that are based in the EU, Norway, and Canada, or listed on the stock exchanges in those countries, are required by law to report annually on the payments that they make to foreign governments, so royalties, taxes, fees, and break down that information at a project-by-project level. This new payment data represents a really exciting resource of new information that's starting to be used more widely. While many companies vigorously resisted these new rules, they're now complying, and we haven't heard any accounts yet that has damaged their commercial well-being. In the US, things are more complicated. The US passed a law requiring this kind of payment reporting in 2010. Then, the American Petroleum Institute, an oil lobby group, sued the US government, claiming that the new reporting requirements were too onerous. The courts sided largely with oil companies, which led to a very long delay in the US government issuing the implementing regulations. Then, in early 2017, Congress voted to repeal the rule altogether, and President Trump signed the order for it to be eliminated. Many observers have interpreted this move as a concession to the oil industry. Along with these voluntary and mandatory initiatives, a number of individual countries and companies have made the choice to advance transparency on their own. For example, NRGI research shows that at least 29 governments, from Australia to Guinea to Peru, have chosen to disclose at least some of their oil and mining sector contracts. The oil company Cosmos chooses to disclose its contracts and also complies with the European payment reporting rules, even though it's a US company and doesn't have to. The oil trader Trafigura discloses data on its payments to governments in EITI countries, also on a voluntary basis. These actions show that individual actors can absolutely do more to be transparent on their own, rather than waiting for it to be a legal requirement. Through all of these actions, the idea of transparency has gained a lot of traction in oil, gas, and mining circles. And the direction of travel is definitely towards greater openness. However, there remains a lot to be done. While the idea of transparency has many allies, in practice, a lot of information is not being disclosed, and secrecy still remains the norm more often than not. Thanks very much for your time.